To humiliate her, they forced her to marry the poorest beggar in the entire village. Amara stood in her wedding gown, unable to stop the tears rolling down her face. She wasn't marrying the man she loved. She wasn't even marrying by choice. She was being handed over like she was nothing more than an object nobody wanted. The villagers couldn't hide their laughter. Some whispered, "What a waste of beauty." Others shook their heads with pity. Standing beside her was a man everyone looked down on. His clothes were torn. His feet were dusty. His beard was unkempt. To the entire village, he was nothing more than a worthless beggar. Only one person looked completely satisfied, her stepmother. She smiled proudly, believing she had finally destroyed the orphan's future. What nobody standing there knew was that the man they mocked was carrying a secret powerful enough to change every life in that village forever. It hadn't always been this way. When Amara's father was alive, Mama Rose treated her like her own daughter. She smiled at her, bought her gifts, and even braided her hair. But the day Amara's father was buried, that kindness disappeared forever. The woman everyone thought was a loving stepmother became someone Amara no longer recognized. From that day, the orphan stopped being a daughter. She became a servant. Every morning before sunrise, she swept the compound, fetched water from the stream, cooked for the entire family, washed everyone's clothes, and worked on the farm until her hands became rough. Yet she never complained. The more people got to know Amara, the more they admired her. The villagers often said, "That girl has a good heart. She's respectful. She's the kind of wife any man would pray for." Those words were like poison to Mama Rose because nobody ever spoke that way about her own daughter. As the years passed, Amara grew into a beautiful young woman. Before long, young men from nearby villages began coming to ask for her hand in marriage. Every proposal Mama Rose rejected, not because Amara wasn't good enough, but because she couldn't bear the thought of the orphan living a better life than her own child. That jealousy soon gave birth to a plan so wicked that the entire village would talk about it for years. One afternoon, Mama Rose was returning from the village market when she saw the man everyone laughed at, the village beggar. Children followed him, mocking him as he walked from house to house asking for food. Most people chased him away. Others insulted him. But the beggar never argued. He simply smiled, thanked those who showed him kindness, and quietly walked away. Mama Rose stopped walking. An evil thought suddenly entered her mind. She looked at the beggar, then slowly smiled to herself. If respectable men want to marry the orphan, then I'll make sure she marries the one man nobody would ever choose. That evening, she secretly sent someone to bring the beggar to her house. When he arrived, she looked him straight in the eyes and said, "If I give you my stepdaughter as your wife, will you accept her?" The beggar remained silent for a long moment. Then he calmly replied, "I will, if she is willing." Mama Rose quickly interrupted him. "Leave that to me. You don't have to worry about the rest." The beggar looked at her quietly. There was something unusual about his eyes, as though he knew much more than he was saying. But he simply nodded, turned around, and disappeared into the night. Mama Rose smiled with satisfaction. She believed the orphan's future had just been destroyed forever. She had no idea she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The following morning, Mama Rose called Amara into the sitting room. Her voice was unusually calm, and for a brief moment, Amara thought something good had finally happened. She stood quietly, waiting for her stepmother to speak, but Mama Rose simply looked at her and said without the slightest emotion, "Prepare yourself. You are getting married tomorrow." Amara's eyes widened in shock. "Married?" she whispered, unable to believe what she had just heard. Before she could ask another question, Mama Rose pointed toward the road outside. "The man waiting for you is your husband." Amara slowly turned to look, and the moment she saw him, her heart sank. Standing outside the gate, leaning on an old walking stick, was the village beggar. She stared in disbelief, convinced it had to be some cruel joke. Looking back at her stepmother with tears already filling her eyes, she asked, "Mama, what did I do wrong? Why are you doing this to me?" But Mama Rosie's face remained cold. "You ask too many questions," she replied. "You should be grateful. At least someone is willing to marry an orphan." Amara collapsed to her knees as tears streamed down her face. She begged, cried, and reminded Mama Rose of the promise her late father had made her keep, but nothing softened the woman's heart. Instead, Mama Rose raised her voice for the neighbors to hear. "If you refuse this marriage, leave my house today. You will never step here again." Amara looked around in despair. She had nowhere else to go, no parents, no relatives, and no home. In that heartbreaking moment, she finally realized she wasn't being given a choice. She was being forced into a life she never wanted. The next morning, the entire village gathered to witness the wedding. Some came out of curiosity, while others came simply to laugh. Amara walked slowly toward the small village square wearing a simple white wedding gown, every step feeling heavier than the last. Her eyes were swollen from crying all night, and she couldn't even lift her head. As she passed, people whispered among themselves, "Such a beautiful girl. What a terrible fate. She deserved so much better." Standing at the front was the beggar. His clothes were still old, his sandals were worn out, and his rough hands revealed years of hard labor. To everyone watching, he looked like the poorest man alive. Only Mama Rose looked happy. The smile on her face grew wider with every passing second because she believed she had finally won. When the village elder asked if Amara accepted the marriage, her lips trembled. For a long moment, she couldn't speak. Then, through tears, she quietly whispered, "I do." The villagers lowered their heads in pity, and some women couldn't hold back their tears. After the ceremony ended, Mama Rose walked away smiling without even looking back at Amara. To her, the orphan was no longer her problem. But as Amara and the beggar began walking toward the tiny hut where he lived, he noticed her silently wiping away another tear. For the first time, he spoke. His voice was calm, gentle, and filled with kindness. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I know you never wanted this." Amara looked at him in surprise. That single sentence was more kindness than she had received from anyone in many years. Life inside the little hut was nothing like Amara had imagined. She expected insults, anger, and a husband who would treat her the way everyone else had, but instead, the beggar surprised her. On the very first morning, he woke before sunrise, fetched water, and prepared breakfast before she even opened her eyes. When Amara tried to help, he simply smiled and said, "You've suffered enough. Let me take care of this." Those words stayed in her heart. As the days turned into weeks, he left every morning with his old walking stick, walking wherever people needed extra hands, helping farmers, carrying heavy loads in the market, and doing whatever honest work he could find. Every evening, he returned home and placed every coin he had earned into Amara's hands, saying, "I don't have much, but whatever I have is yours." Amara couldn't understand him. This was the same man the whole village mocked every day, yet he treated her with more kindness than anyone ever had. Slowly, the tears disappeared from her face, the fear in her heart began to fade, and for the first time since losing her father, she smiled again. She no longer saw a beggar, she saw a good man, and without even realizing it, she had already begun to love him. Yet every single day, one question refused to leave her mind: who was this man, really? Prince Kofi had already found the answer he had spent years searching for, but Amara had no idea. Every act of kindness, every sacrifice, and every smile she gave him, he quietly treasured, not because he still doubted her, but because he wanted to be absolutely certain. One afternoon, while Amara was preparing dinner, an elderly man arrived at their little hut. He was neatly dressed and carried himself with quiet dignity. The moment he saw the beggar, he respectfully bowed his head. Amara frowned in confusion, for she had never seen anyone show a beggar such honor before. Before she could overhear, the beggar stepped outside to speak with the old man. In a low voice, the visitor said, "Your Highness, the king is dying. The palace cannot wait any longer. The council has been searching for you everywhere." Prince Kofi remained silent for a moment before looking back at the tiny hut, where Amara softly hummed as she prepared their meal. A gentle smile spread across his face. "I have finally found her," he said. "I only needed to know whether she loved the man before meeting the prince." The old advisor smiled and asked, "So, as she passed?" Prince Kofi nodded slowly. "She passed long ago. I was the one who wasn't ready to let go." The old advisor lowered his head and replied, "Then it's time to take your queen home."
The following morning, the peaceful village was shaken by a sound nobody had ever heard before. Luxury vehicles, one after another, they rode slowly into the village. Children stopped playing. Farmers abandoned their work. Even the village elders hurried outside. The convoy drove straight to the tiny hut where the beggar lived. Nobody could understand why. Mama Rose stepped outside her house, curious like everyone else. Then, the doors of the first vehicle opened. Royal guards stepped out, dressed in magnificent uniforms. Without saying a word, they walked towards the beggar hut. A few seconds later, Prince Kofi stepped outside, still wearing the same old clothes. The commander immediately dropped to one knee. Every other guard followed. Your Royal Highness, the kingdom has come to take you home." The entire village froze. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Mama Rose stared at the man she had mocked, unable to believe her own eyes. The commander respectfully handed Prince Kofi a royal garment. He slowly removed the torn clothes, the same clothes everyone had laughed at for months. When he appeared wearing the royal attire, the villagers gasped. It was impossible. The man they had called a worthless beggar was the crown prince. Amara stood completely speechless. Tears filled her eyes once again, but this time they weren't tears of pain. Prince Kofi walked gently toward her, held both of her hands, looked into her eyes, and smiled. "I promised myself I would only marry a woman who loved my heart before my crown. You loved a beggar without knowing he was a prince, and today I finally know I chose the right woman." Mama Rose's legs became weak. She collapsed onto the ground. For the first time in her life, she realized the orphan she tried to disgrace had become the future queen. Prince Kofi didn't forget what Mama Rose had done. He quietly asked Amara one question. "Did she force you into this marriage?" Amara lowered her head, then slowly nodded. The entire village became silent. For the first time, people realized they had laughed at a woman who had been suffering all along. The village elders immediately turned toward Mama Rose. The truth came out. How she had abused the orphan for years. How she had rejected every honest man who wanted to marry her. How she had forced her into a marriage she never wanted, simply because jealousy had filled her heart. The same villagers who once laughed now looked at Mama Rose with disgust. Prince Kofi could have punished her. He had the power to do so, but instead he simply said, "The greatest punishment for a wicked heart is living with the shame of its own actions." Mama Rose fell to her knees. She cried. She begged Amara to forgive her. But Amara quietly wiped away her tears and walked away, not because she hated her, but because some wounds can only heal when you stop living where they were created. That afternoon, Amara left the village besides Prince Kofi, not as the orphan everyone pitied, but as the woman who would one day become their queen. Months later, she returned, not with revenge, not with pride. She returned to build a school for orphaned children, so no child would ever suffer the way she once had, because the girl they tried to humiliate had become the queen everyone admired. Sometimes the people who try the hardest to destroy your future are only preparing the road to the destiny God has already chosen for you.